He thought he was untouchable, a powerful store owner who believed he could kick out anyone he didn't like, especially a black veteran who had served his country. But what happened next? No one saw it coming. In just minutes, his entire world would come crashing down. And the man he humiliated? He was about to make a move so shocking, so jaw-dropping, it would change everything. Stay tuned, because this is a story you won't believe. James Carter stepped into the small grocery store, his footsteps slow but steady. His worn-out military jacket hung loosely over his broad shoulders, the faded medals on his chest telling stories of battles fought long ago. The store smelled of stale bread and cheap detergent, its aisles narrow, shelves stocked with dusty cans and faded snack packets. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was enough for what he needed: a simple loaf of bread and a carton of milk. John Reynolds, the store owner, stood behind the counter, wiping his hands on his stained apron. His sharp eyes caught sight of James the moment he walked in. His lips curled into a smirk, a deep-rooted prejudice flickering in his expression. He leaned forward on the counter, watching as James quietly moved toward the shelves, running his fingers along the price tags. A few customers stood around, minding their own business, their conversations fading into hushed whispers. John's voice broke the silence. "What do you think you're doing here?" His tone was cold, laced with mockery. James turned his head slightly, confused for a second. "Just getting some groceries." John chuckled, shaking his head. He stepped out from behind the counter, his boots clicking against the tiled floor as he made his way toward James. "We don't serve people like you here," he said, loud enough for the other customers to hear. James froze for a moment. His fingers tightened around the handle of the milk carton he had just picked up. He had faced racism before, had endured insults and glares in silence, but this was different. This wasn't just a glance or a muttered slur under someone's breath. This was open humiliation, spoken without shame. He looked John straight in the eyes. "I served this country," he said calmly, his voice steady but firm. "I fought for people like you." John scoffed. "Fought? You mean you killed your own kind for a paycheck?" He turned toward the other customers, throwing his hands up dramatically. "You hear that, folks? He thinks wearing a uniform makes him one of us." A few people chuckled nervously. Others shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. A young woman in the corner suddenly raised her phone, recording the interaction, her fingers gripping the edges tightly. James exhaled slowly, keeping his composure. "All I want is to buy some food," he said, his voice even. John sneered. "And I want a store without beggars. Looks like we both can't have what we want." He snatched the milk from James's hand and let it drop to the floor, the carton splitting open on impact, white liquid spreading across the tiles. The room fell into silence. A few gasps were heard, but no one stepped forward. No one spoke up. James's jaw tightened. He had been through war, seen men lose their lives, watched his friends die in the dirt. But somehow, this moment, standing in a simple grocery store, being treated like filth, stung in a way he hadn't expected. John, seeing that James hadn't reacted, laughed loudly. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue, or do you need permission to speak?" He reached out suddenly, grabbing the old faded cap on James's head, the one embroidered with U.S. Army, and yanked it off, tossing it to the floor. "There, now you're just another nobody." James didn't move. His fists clenched at his sides, his breathing steady, his heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. His eyes, however, didn't show anger. They showed something worse: calculated patience, the kind of patience that came before a storm. John smirked, turning to the other customers. "Somebody get this man a cardboard sign so he can start begging outside where he belongs." The room erupted in uneasy murmurs. A few people shook their heads, some whispered, "This isn't right." But still, no one intervened. James slowly bent down, picked up his cap and dusted it off. He placed it back on his head, adjusting it carefully. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. His voice was low, controlled, almost too calm. "It's done," he said into the receiver. "Execute the order." John's smirk faltered. The store, once filled with whispered conversations and quiet laughter, fell into complete silence. The next few moments would change everything. John's smug grin faltered, his confidence flickering as he watched James slip his phone back into his pocket. The way James stood, too calm, too composed, sent a strange unease crawling up John's spine. The words, "Execute the order," echoed in his head, but he quickly shook off the feeling. John let out a dry chuckle, forcing himself to regain control of the situation. "Oh, so that's how it is, huh?" he mocked, stepping closer. "You gonna call your little friends? Maybe cry to the news? Pathetic." James didn't react. He simply stood there, hands resting at his sides, eyes locked onto John with an unreadable expression. The silence stretched, heavy and tense. A couple of customers exchanged nervous glances. The young woman recording the scene whispered to the man next to her, "Did you hear what he just said? What order?" The man shrugged but kept his eyes on James, sensing something was off. Then, outside the store, the first sign of something unusual happened. A black SUV pulled up. Not just any SUV, sleek, heavily tinted, and moving with purpose. John didn't notice at first. He was too busy feeding off the attention, puffing out his chest. "What's the matter, old man? You look like you're waiting for something." James didn't answer. Another car pulled up, then another. Engines hummed, doors clicked open, and polished shoes hit the pavement in perfect unison. The once quiet street outside was suddenly filled with figures stepping out of vehicles. Men in dark suits moving swiftly, their presence radiating power and authority. John finally noticed. His cocky expression wavered as he glanced toward the front window. His brow furrowed. "What the?" More people stepped out, military personnel, a man in a high-ranking uniform, his chest decorated with medals far shinier than James's worn-out ones. Beside him, a stern-looking woman in a suit, her sharp eyes scanning the store through the glass. The entire grocery store went silent. The customers inside began whispering, tension crackling in the air. John turned back to James, his confidence now laced with uncertainty. "Who the hell are you?" His voice wasn't as sharp anymore, it held something else. Hesitation. James finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he adjusted his sleeves, his fingers brushing over one of his medals. Then, he locked eyes with John and spoke in a voice so steady, so cold, it sent a shiver down everyone's spine. "I gave you a chance," James said simply. John felt a lump form in his throat, though he wasn't sure why. Before he could respond, the store door swung open. The first man entered, a high-ranking military official. The second, a federal agent, badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The customers stepped back, making way for them. Phones were still recording. Every eye in the store was now fixed on John, who stood frozen behind the counter. John's mouth opened, but no words came out. Then, the woman in the suit stepped forward, and with a voice as sharp as a blade, spoke the words that would make John's world come crashing down. "John Reynolds, you're under federal investigation." John's face turned ghostly pale, his breath hitching in his throat. His fingers twitched against the counter as if he needed to grab onto something solid to keep himself from crumbling. He blinked, shaking his head slightly, convinced he had misheard. "Under... what?" His voice barely carried, the once smug and confident tone now drenched in disbelief. The woman in the suit didn't flinch. She remained composed, her dark eyes pinned on him like a predator watching prey. She reached into her blazer and pulled out a thick, official-looking document before flipping it open. "Federal investigation," she repeated, her voice crisp and unwavering. "For tax fraud, illegal hiring practices, workplace discrimination, and multiple civil rights violations." John's lips parted, but the words never came. The color drained from his face as he staggered backward, nearly knocking over the register behind him. The customers inside the store stood frozen, watching the unfolding scene like it was something out of a movie. The woman recording on her phone zoomed in, capturing every detail. James remained still, his expression unreadable. John finally found his voice, though it wavered. This is a joke, right? He forced out a shaky laugh, trying to convince himself more than anyone else. You can't just walk in here and... Actually, the military officer who had entered with the agent interrupted. We can. And we have. John's head snapped toward him, and for the first time, he recognized the insignia on the man's chest. It wasn't just any officer standing before him. It was someone high-ranking, someone powerful. The agent continued. For months we've been gathering evidence, financial records, employee complaints, witness statements, your history of racial discrimination, your refusal to serve certain customers, the illegal wages you've been paying your workers. It's all documented, Mr. Reynolds. John's knees nearly buckled. This is insane. I didn't do anything wrong. His voice cracked. This is my store. I can run it how I want. James finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward, closing the space between them until he was just a few feet away. The once calm, patient look on his face had shifted into something colder, something that made John physically shrink back. You thought you were untouchable, James said, his voice low but firm. You thought no one would ever hold you accountable. You thought you could humiliate me, degrade me, strip me of my dignity, just because you could. John opened his mouth, but no words came out. James tilted his head slightly. Let me tell you something, John. He paused for just a second, making sure the entire store was listening. The thing about power is that it doesn't belong to people like you. John flinched, his skin now clammy, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. The woman in the suit stepped forward again, flipping another page in her folder. Effective immediately, this establishment is being seized under federal authority. Your business license is being revoked. Your accounts are frozen. And as of this moment, Mr. Reynolds... She paused for effect, watching as his chest rose and fell in panicked breaths. You no longer own this store. John's entire body locked up. His eyes widened, his breath caught in his throat, and for the first time, the weight of his downfall hit him like a freight train. No, 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 this is my store. His voice was shrill now, desperation dripping from every syllable. He lunged forward, grabbing onto the edge of the counter like a man holding onto a ledge before falling into an abyss. This is mine. I built this place. You can't just take it from me. The military officer sighed and looked toward James. Would you like to do the honors, General Carter? John's breath stuttered. General Carter? James locked eyes with him, and for the first time, John realized who he had been messing with. His entire body tensed as a chilling realization crawled up his spine. James's voice was calm. I just did. And with those words, John Reynolds lost everything. John stood frozen, his mind racing, his breath shallow. He could hear the blood pounding in his ears, drowning out the murmurs of the onlookers, the clicking of phones recording, the dull hum of the store's fluorescent lights. His hands gripped the counter so tightly that his knuckles turned white, his body swaying slightly as if the ground beneath him was no longer solid. James Carter stood before him, unwavering, his presence radiating something John had never encountered before, an unshakable authority that didn't need to be announced. This can't be happening, John muttered under his breath. He turned wildly to the military officer, the suited agent, then back to James. This is some kind of mistake. His voice cracked, his desperation spilling into the open. You can't just take my store. The agent arched an eyebrow, flipping through her documents before speaking in a measured tone. Mr. Reynolds, you don't seem to understand. This is not a request. This is a legally executed order, signed, stamped, and approved. As of this moment, you have no authority over this establishment, its finances, or its operations. John's breathing became erratic. You can't, no, this is my store. His voice rose in pitch, cracking with every word. He turned to the customers, the same ones he had ignored, dismissed, or belittled over the years. You all know me. I've been running this place for years, tell them. But no one spoke. Some avoided his gaze, shifting uncomfortably. Others watched with blank expressions, their faces unreadable. The young woman still held her phone up, Her camera locked on him, recording every second of his downfall. And then, it got worse. The military officer took a step forward and removed a folded document from his jacket. "Since you're struggling to process this, let me make it even clearer," he said, unfolding the paper and holding it up in front of John's panicked, darting eyes. At the top of the page, in bold official lettering, were the words, beneath it, a stamped signature, the U.S. Department of Defense. John's stomach dropped. The officer's voice was firm. "Your store, your property, was never yours to begin with. This building, the land beneath it, and everything inside it was under an old federal lease agreement, one that you violated with your illegal practices and racial discrimination. As of this moment, that lease has been transferred." John's voice came out as a whisper, barely audible. "Transferred? To who?" The officer smirked and looked at James. John's eyes followed. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp, freshly signed contract. He unfolded it with steady hands, then turned it toward John so he could read the name at the bottom. It read, "New owner, Brigadier General James Carter, Radidau." The air in the store shifted. The customers gasped, murmurs rippling through the crowd. The young woman recording let out an audible, stunned, "Oh my God," while others exchanged wide-eyed looks of disbelief. John staggered back, his world spinning. His throat was dry, his mind blank. "No," he mumbled. "No!" He turned back to James, his face twisted in rage, fear, and disbelief. "You set me up." James didn't blink. His expression remained neutral, calm, but his words cut sharper than a blade. "You set yourself up," he replied. "You thought no one would hold you accountable. You thought you could humiliate me, degrade me, strip me of my dignity, just because you felt like it. But today, John..." He stepped forward, his towering presence making John shrink back even further. "Today you learned that power doesn't belong to people like you." John's lips trembled. He tried to speak, but the words refused to come. His mouth opened and closed, his breath shallow, his body trembling. The agent cleared her throat. "Mr. Reynolds, you have two options," she stated matter-of-factly. "You can leave now, on your own, or security will escort you out." John's chest rose and fell violently. His hands curled into fists, his nails digging into his palms. He had ruled over this store, over this space for years. He had thrown people out, never once thinking the tables would turn on him. And yet, here he was, a disgraced man, a powerless man. For the first time, John Reynolds had nowhere to run. James watched him in silence, his expression unwavering, his presence unshaken. The whole world was watching. And John Reynolds had never felt smaller. John's legs felt weak, his body swaying slightly as if his own weight had become too much to bear. His hands twitched at his sides, his fingers desperate to latch onto something, anything that could anchor him to reality. But there was nothing, only the crushing weight of his own downfall. The air inside the store was thick, suffocating. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, their hushed voices weaving together like an unbearable hum of judgment and disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to be in control, his store, his rules. Yet now, the man he had mocked, humiliated, and degraded stood before him, not as a helpless old veteran, but as the man who owned everything John once thought was his. John's head snapped up, desperation clawing at his throat. His mind was racing, trying to find an escape, a loophole, anything to undo this nightmare. His voice cracked as he stammered, "This isn't legal. You can't just come in here and..." The female agent didn't even let him finish. She pulled out another document, flipping it open. "Mr. Reynolds, you might want to read this before embarrassing yourself any further." She stepped forward and held the paper inches from his face. John's eyes darted over the words, his breath catching in his throat. Court-ordered property transfer, signed, sealed, irreversible. The finality of those words hit him like a hammer to the chest. His throat tightened, his pulse hammering against his skull. His hands shook violently, barely able to keep from snatching the paper and ripping it to shreds. "This store," the agent continued, her voice cutting through him like a knife, "was leased under government contracts. But due to your illegal activities, repeated complaints, and confirmed civil rights violations, the ownership has been revoked under federal law. It is now permanently and irrevocably under the possession of General Carter." John's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. Panic clawed at his insides, cold and suffocating. This was really happening. His eyes darted around wildly, looking for someone, anyone who would defend him. He turned to his customers, the same people he had dismissed as unimportant for years, the same people he had refused service to, insulted, belittled. Surely someone would take his side. "Are you all just gonna stand there?" His voice cracked, wobbling between rage and desperation. He gestured frantically toward James. "You're really letting them do this to me? This is my business. I built this place. I gave you people jobs. He was cut off by a sound that made his blood run cold. Laughter. It started as a chuckle, low and amused. Then it grew, spreading like wildfire. First from the young woman recording, then from a few customers in the back, until more and more joined in. It wasn't mocking laughter. It was the kind that came from sheer disbelief, from witnessing the poetic justice of it all. John's face flushed deep red. His hands balled into trembling fists. "You think this is funny?" He spat, his voice rising, cracking under the pressure. "You think this is a joke?" The young woman lowered her phone just enough to look him straight in the eye. She smirked. "It's hilarious," she said. John felt sick. His entire body burned, rage bubbling just beneath his skin. His gaze shot back to James, the man who had destroyed him in mere minutes, standing there with that infuriating calmness. John couldn't take it anymore. With a roar of frustration, he lunged. His body moved before his mind could stop him, his fists aiming straight for James. But before he could even get close, a hand caught his wrist. Not just any hand, a military-trained grip, firm, unyielding. In a single swift motion, John was twisted around, his arm pinned behind his back. Pain shot through his shoulder, forcing him to his knees. The store gasped in unison. The officer holding him barely looked fazed. "You just assaulted a federal officer's guest," he stated calmly, tightening his grip. "Congratulations, Mr. Reynolds. You just made this a whole lot worse for yourself." John let out a strangled sound, half pain, half sheer humiliation. Pinned to the ground, face burning with shame, all he could do was watch as James Carter stepped forward, towering over him. James looked down at him, his eyes steady, unwavering. And then he smiled. Not out of revenge, not out of malice, but with the simple satisfaction of a man who had just reclaimed his dignity. John Reynolds, the man who once thought he was untouchable, was now on his knees, completely powerless. And James Carter? He hadn't even lifted a finger. John gritted his teeth, his face twisted in pain and humiliation as the officer's grip remained firm, unyielding. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, his body pressed against the cold tile floor. His wrist pinned behind his back like he was some kind of criminal. The weight of it, of everything that had just happened, settled over him like a lead blanket, suffocating, unbearable. This was a nightmare, a sick, twisted, impossible nightmare, his own store, his own turf, his own rules. And yet, here he was, kneeling like a disgraced man, surrounded by the same people he had once looked down on. The very people who had never dared to challenge him were now watching his downfall unfold with satisfaction in their eyes. James Carter, the man he had ridiculed and humiliated, stood above him, calm, dignified, and completely in control. John's chest heaved, his mind screaming for a way out, for some kind of miracle that would reverse everything. This couldn't be real. It just couldn't. "Get off me," John growled through clenched teeth, struggling hard against the officer's grip. "This is my damn store, you hear me? I built this place from the ground up. You can't just—" "You built this place?" James finally spoke, his voice steady, unreadable. John snapped his head up, his breath shaking with rage. "Yeah, I did. I worked my ass off for this store. You think you can just steal it from me? James's expression didn't change. You built this store, he repeated, his voice even, firm. Yet when I walked in here, you treated me like I didn't belong. John froze. His own words echoed back at him, twisting like a knife in his gut. James took a slow step forward, his shadow casting over John's hunched form. You made sure I felt small in this place, he continued, his voice filled with something deeper than anger. You mocked my service. You tore the respect off my shoulders. You threw my cap to the ground like it meant nothing. The customers were silent now. Every word carried weight, sinking deep into the space between them. And now you expect sympathy? James's head tilted slightly, his gaze locked onto John's. Tell me, John, when you humiliated people, when you threw them out for no reason, did you stop and wonder if they had a family to feed? If they had nowhere else to go? If they had fought battles you could never understand? John said nothing. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Because there was nothing to say. For years he had ruled this store like a kingdom. He had turned people away for reasons that weren't even reasons. Too poor, too black, too foreign, too different. He had felt untouchable. Until now. Now he was the one being thrown out like he was nothing. James crouched down, leveling their gazes. His voice dropped to a chilling calm. This is the first time in your life that you've been powerless, he said. John swallowed hard, his throat dry, his heart hammering violently. James held his gaze for a moment longer before slowly standing back up. Then he turned to the officer holding John down. Let him go. The officer hesitated for a split second, but then, without a word, he released his grip. John fell forward, catching himself on his hands, his body trembling. For a second he just stayed there, his head hanging low, his breath uneven. His mind was blank, spinning wildly, grasping for something, anything, that could salvage his pride, his store, his life. He pushed himself up onto shaky feet, his back drenched in sweat, his hands curled into fists at his sides, his jaw locked so tight it hurt. This isn't over, he finally muttered, his voice a low, venomous growl. James watched him, his expression unreadable. John's breath shook with fury. He looked around the store, his store, only to find dozens of eyes staring back at him. Not with sympathy, not with concern, but with satisfaction. It was in their expressions, in their hushed whispers, in the way their phones were still recording. John felt a deep, suffocating rage swell inside him. His whole life he had been the one in control. Now, he was nothing. His eyes darted around desperately, looking for something, someone to take his side. And that's when he saw him. Standing near the entrance, a familiar face. Ethan, his only employee. The kid had been working at the store for 2 years, a skinny, timid thing with messy brown hair and a habit of stuttering when he got nervous. John's chest heaved. Ethan, he barked, his voice sharp, commanding. Tell them this is my store, that they can't do this. Ethan didn't move. John's breathing hitched. Boy, I gave you a job when no one else would. You owe me. Ethan finally met his gaze. And then, in a quiet voice, he said, You never paid me what I deserved. John stumbled back, stunned. Ethan lifted his chin slightly, a quiet strength in his eyes that John had never noticed before. You made me work overtime without pay, Ethan continued, his voice trembling slightly but steady. You always told me I should be grateful. But you never even looked at me like I mattered. John shook his head rapidly. I gave you a chance. No, Ethan cut him off, his voice growing firmer. James Carter gave me a chance. He's the one who signed my new contract this morning. John's stomach dropped. Ethan took a slow step forward. I work for him now. A few people in the crowd let out quiet gasps. John stared at Ethan, his mouth open, his hands shaking. No, this couldn't be real. James owns this place now, Ethan said, his voice steady, a quiet sense of justice in his tone. And we all know this store's finally gonna be better without you. John felt the final blow hit. His head spun. His knees felt weak. For years, he had treated his employees like they were beneath him. He had used them, underpaid them, made them feel like they should be thankful to have a job at all. And now, they had turned their backs on him. Because of James Carter. Because of the man he had tried to destroy, the man who had just won. John's breathing came in short, ragged bursts. His vision blurred at the edges, his mind screaming for a way out. But there was none, no escape, no allies, no second chances. Everything was gone. His store, his employees, his power. All of it ripped away in a single, crushing moment. And the worst part? Nobody cared. Not a single person in that room pitied him. Not the customers, not the officers, not the young woman still recording every moment on her phone. Not even Ethan, the boy he had grossly underpaid for years. John swallowed hard, his throat burning. His body trembled as he turned his gaze back to James Carter, the man who had single-handedly dismantled his entire life. James's expression remained unshaken, calm, powerful, unbothered. It infuriated John. This man had just taken everything from him, and yet he didn't smirk, didn't gloat, didn't even look remotely satisfied. John's rage boiled over, his hands curled into fists, his entire body shaking with fury. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" His voice was hoarse, raw. "You walk in here like some damn hero, like you're cleaning up the town, but you're no different than me." James didn't react. John's teeth clenched so hard it hurt. "You're a fraud. You didn't earn this. You just used your little military connections to pull some strings and steal what's mine." A few customers in the back scoffed audibly. Someone whispered, "He still doesn't get it." James finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I didn't steal anything from you, John." John let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, sure. So what, you just waltzed in here and the government magically handed you my store?" James's gaze didn't waver. "No," he said simply. "I bought it." The words hit like a slap to the face. John froze. His eyes darted back and forth between James and the military officer standing nearby. "You're lying," he spat, his voice uneven. "There's no way you had the money to—" "The government didn't just seize your store for your illegal practices," the agent cut in smoothly. "They also auctioned off the property and assets, as per federal law." John's breath caught in his throat. "Auctioned? No. I placed my bid the moment the paperwork was signed," James continued. His voice was steady, unwavering. "And, as of this morning, I legally own everything in this building." John felt the blood drain from his face. This wasn't just about taking his store. James had been one step ahead the entire time. From the moment John had thrown him out, from the moment he had humiliated him, James already knew what was going to happen. John had played himself. James had simply watched him dig his own grave. John stumbled back, his knees weak. "No," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "No, this can't—" "You did this to yourself," James cut in. His voice wasn't mocking. It wasn't even angry. It was simply a statement of fact. John's fingernails dug into his palms. "This store was never yours," James continued. "You had a lease. You broke that lease. You broke the law. And when the consequences came, you had no defense. You made your choices and now you're facing the price." John's chest heaved violently. His hands shook. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. His store, his business, his empire, all of it was gone. And the man he had humiliated just hours ago now owned everything he once ruled. James took a slow, deliberate step forward. "You see, John," he said quietly, "when you threw me out of this store, you thought you were stepping on a nobody." He held John's gaze, his expression unreadable. "But you weren't." John's body tensed. "You were stepping on a man who has spent his life fighting battles far worse than you could ever imagine," James continued. "A man who has built more, lost more, and won more than you ever will." The words settled like thunder in the air. John felt like he was suffocating. His entire body screamed at him to fight back, to say something, anything. But he couldn't, because deep down he knew James was right. John Reynolds had spent his entire life stepping on others, thinking he would always be on top. And now, he was nothing. John stood frozen, his breath uneven, his skin clammy as the weight of his defeat settled into his bones. Every fiber of his being screamed for an escape, for a way to twist this in his favor. But there was none. No loophole, no second chances, no mercy. James Carter, the man he had mocked, humiliated, and thrown out like trash, had not only taken everything from him, but had done it legally, effortlessly, and without breaking a sweat. The realization hit John like a hammer to the chest. He had lost. And what made it worse, what made it unbearable, was that James hadn't even needed revenge. He hadn't needed to yell or threaten or fight. He had simply waited. And John had destroyed himself. His throat felt dry, his lips trembling as he forced out a weak, broken whisper. "This isn't fair." James exhaled sharply through his nose, not in amusement, but in quiet disbelief. He shook his head. "Fair," he repeated. "You think this isn't fair?" His voice was still calm, measured, but there was something sharper beneath it now, something tired, something done. "You threw me out of here like I was garbage," James continued, his voice never rising but carrying more weight than any shout could. "You insulted my service, my dignity, my existence, all because you thought you could." John flinched. James took a slow step closer. "You used your power to humiliate others, to strip them of their worth. You laughed at their suffering, believing they had no right to stand where you stood." He tilted his head slightly, his eyes locked onto John's. "But now, when you're the one who's powerless, suddenly it's not fair." John squeezed his eyes shut, as if blocking out James's words could somehow make this nightmare disappear. James studied him for a moment before shaking his head. "You don't know what unfair is," he said, his tone cold now. "You've never faced a system designed to work against you. You've never been denied a job because of your skin. Never been followed around in a store like a criminal. Never had doors slammed in your face for reasons beyond your control." John's jaw tightened. "You've spent your whole life taking from others," James went on, his voice steady, merciless, "taking their dignity, their opportunities, their choices. You thought you were invincible, untouchable, that no one would ever hold you accountable." James's gaze bored into him, unrelenting. "But today," he said, his voice dropping just enough to send a chill down John's spine, "you finally met someone who could." John staggered back, his legs barely holding him up. His heart pounded violently in his chest. This was worse than losing his store. This was worse than being humiliated in front of everyone. James Carter wasn't just taking everything away from him. He was making him face who he really was. The silence in the store was deafening. The customers were still watching, their expressions unreadable. Phones were still pointed at him, recording, documenting. His humiliation wasn't just happening in this moment. It would live on forever. John's body felt like it was on fire. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. He had never felt this small. He looked around wildly, his panic growing. No allies, no sympathy, no escape. His fingers twitched at his sides, his body vibrating with frustration. And then, in one final, desperate act of defiance, he snapped. His eyes darkened, rage flashing through his entire being like a dying flame trying to reignite. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he spat, his voice shaking with fury. "You think you're better than me just because you got lucky? Just because you played your little games and won?" James didn't react. John stepped closer, his body trembling with rage. "You're nothing," he barked. "Nothing but a washed-up, broken old man clinging to a past that doesn't matter anymore." His breath came out in ragged gasps. "You may have stolen this store from me, but you'll always be a nobody. You hear me? Bang. The sound of the store doors slamming open cut him off like a knife. John's head jerked toward the entrance, his breath freezing in his chest. And then, his world shattered completely. Because standing in the doorway, in crisp, decorated military uniforms, were 3 high-ranking officers. And behind them, a convoy of armed soldiers. John's blood turned to ice. The store was dead silent. The officers stepped forward in perfect unison, their polished boots clicking against the tile. Their expressions were blank, unreadable. John felt his entire body lock up, and then one of them saluted. Not to him, to James. "Sir," the leading officer said, his voice sharp, unwavering. "Apologies for the delay. We're here at your request." John forgot how to breathe. James barely acknowledged them, his expression neutral. "You're right on time," he said simply. John's knees nearly buckled. The officer nodded, then turned his gaze toward John, his face unreadable. "Is this the individual you mentioned, General Carter?" General Carter. The words hit John like a freight train. His mouth went dry, his limbs cold. His entire world shifted, because this wasn't just a man he had thrown out of his store. This wasn't just some retired veteran looking for groceries. This was a high-ranking general, a man with power beyond anything John had ever imagined. And he had just insulted him, humiliated him, tried to destroy him. John's vision blurred. His throat closed up. His stomach twisted into a painful knot. James finally turned his full attention back to him, his expression unreadable. "You were saying?" he asked, his voice calm. John stumbled back, his entire body trembling, and for the first time in his life, he was truly afraid. John's body felt like it had been drained of every last ounce of strength. His legs threatened to give out beneath him, his stomach churning violently as the weight of the moment crushed him. He had spent his life believing he was in control, that his store was his kingdom, that his word was law. But now he stood in front of a man whose power went beyond anything he could have ever imagined. A general. John hadn't just insulted a man, he had insulted a figure of national respect. The kind of man who didn't just serve a country, he helped shape it. And now that man was staring him down, surrounded by a force of soldiers, officers, and officials who answered to him. John had never felt smaller. The lead officer, the one who had saluted James, kept his stern gaze locked onto John. His presence alone sent a chill down John's spine. Sharp posture, cold eyes, unwavering authority. He turned to James. "What would you like us to do with him, sir?" John felt his knees buckle. He could barely process what was happening, but those words shattered whatever pride he had left. The entire store watched in absolute silence. Every single person, the customers, the officers, the young woman still recording, was waiting for James Carter to decide his fate. John had been the one calling the shots his whole life. Now his future was in the hands of the man he had just humiliated. James was quiet for a long moment. His eyes never left John's. His expression wasn't vengeful. It wasn't cruel. It was something worse. It was pure indifference. John, who had thrived on making others feel powerless, now felt the horrifying reality of what that meant. James took a slow breath before speaking. "Let him go." John snapped his head up. He had expected everything but that. The lead officer raised an eyebrow. "Sir?" James's voice remained calm. "Let him walk out of here on his own. No handcuffs, no officers escorting him. Just let him go." The officer hesitated. He was clearly waiting for an explanation. John was waiting for one too. James tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "He doesn't deserve a dramatic exit," he said simply. "He doesn't deserve to be dragged out screaming, fighting to keep his dignity." John's breath hitched, because the truth behind those words was far worse than any punishment. James Carter had already beaten him. He had already taken everything, his store, his power, his reputation. And now he wasn't even worth dragging out. He was being dismissed, discarded, like he didn't matter, like he had never mattered. John's entire body shook with rage, with shame, with something he had never felt before. True, complete powerlessness. The lead officer nodded, stepping back. "Understood, sir." James didn't say anything else. He didn't look at John. He just turned, walking past him like he was nothing but empty space. John felt his heart sink, because that's exactly what he was now. Nothing. The officers stepped aside, clearing a path toward the exit. The customers in the store moved away from him too, creating a long, open walk toward the front door. It was the longest walk of John Reynolds's life. He took a step. His hands trembled at his sides, his legs barely holding him up. Another step. His breath was shallow, weak. His feet dragged against the tile. He had never noticed how loud his footsteps were before. The customers didn't cheer. They didn't mock him. They didn't clap. They just watched him take the walk of shame out of the store that had once been his. John reached the door, pausing for a brief second. He turned his head slightly, looking back over his shoulder. James Carter was already behind the counter. His store now. His empire. John swallowed hard. He had lost. And the worst part? No one would remember him. John's hand hovered over the door handle, his fingers trembling. He could feel the weight of every single stare drilling into his back. The humiliation was unbearable, suffocating, a fire burning through his chest. Just hours ago, he had stood in this very spot as the ruler of this store. He had strutted through these aisles, barked orders, thrown people out like they were nothing. Now, he was the one being thrown out. He turned his head slightly, sneaking one last look at the people inside. A desperate, foolish hope clung to him. Maybe someone, anyone, would tell him this wasn't real. But all he saw were faces he had ignored for years. The young woman who had been recording? Her phone was still aimed at him. The smirk on her lips was gone now, replaced with something worse. Pity. The customers he had overcharged, the ones he had refused service to, the ones he had sneered at when they had counted out coins just to buy bread. They all just watched, not saying a word. Ethan, his former employee, stood behind the counter now. He wasn't cowering anymore. He wasn't stammering. His shoulders were squared, his chin lifted. He looked like he belonged. And James Carter? He didn't even glance in John's direction. John felt his stomach twist. It wasn't anger. It was worse than anger. It was being forgotten. No one begged him to stay. No one stopped him. Because no one cared. The truth hit him all at once. A crushing, inescapable weight. He had spent years pretending to be powerful, making others feel small, as if the walls of this store made him untouchable. But in reality, he had never been anything more than a small, bitter man in a store that was never really his. And now, his reign was over. John let out a slow, shaky breath. His fingers clenched the door handle so tight that his knuckles turned white. And then, he pulled it open. The cold outside air slammed into his face. It felt harsher than before, sharper, because the moment his foot stepped over the threshold, it was real. He was out, no longer the owner, no longer in control, just another man on the sidewalk. The door closed behind him, a loud, final click. John blinked. His hands curled into fists, his entire body shaking with disbelief. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. He turned around fast, gripping the door handle, but it didn't budge. It was locked. His store. But now he was locked out. His breath came out in sharp, panicked gasps. His heartbeat pounded against his skull. He stepped back, looking through the glass. Inside, the store was moving on without him. James Carter stood at the counter, calmly reviewing paperwork. The employees, his former employees, were already taking their places behind the registers, adjusting their uniforms like they had done this job under a different boss their whole lives. Customers lined up, buying groceries like nothing had changed, but everything had changed. For John. And that's when it sank in, the most horrifying part of all. The store didn't need him. The world didn't need him. Life would go on without him. He had spent years treating people like they were beneath him, acting like he was irreplaceable, like this store wouldn't run without his presence. But in the end, he was the only thing that had ever been disposable. John's breathing turned shallow. His hands ran through his hair, gripping at his scalp. He had to do something. He had to stop this. Maybe if he explained, maybe if he got the right lawyer, maybe if he... "Excuse me, sir." John flinched. He turned sharply, coming face to face with an older woman. She was holding a shopping bag, standing a few feet away from him, looking nervous. For a split second he thought maybe she was here for him. Maybe she had come to tell him that this wasn't right, that she supported him. Instead, she hesitated, then gestured toward the entrance. "Could you move? You're blocking the door." John stared at her. The words hit like a slap to the face. For years he had stood in that very doorway, deciding who was welcome and who wasn't. Now, he was just an obstacle, a nuisance standing in the way of someone else's day. John stumbled back, his face burning with shame. The woman gave him a strange look before walking past him, the automatic doors sliding open for her effortlessly. They didn't open for him, because he didn't belong there anymore. The doors slid shut, and just like that, John Reynolds disappeared from the store that had once been his kingdom. The store moved on, and John, he had nowhere to go. John stumbled down the sidewalk, his mind spiraling into chaos. His feet moved on their own, carrying him away from the store he had once ruled, the store that no longer had a place for him. His chest heaved, his throat burned, his vision blurred with the weight of what had just happened. He kept walking, though he had nowhere to go. For years, he had looked out through the store's glass windows and watched people walk these streets, judging them, deciding who was worth serving and who wasn't. Now he was just another nameless man wandering the sidewalk. He could still hear the whispers, the lingering echoes of the laughter, the gasps, the quiet disbelief as he had been publicly humiliated. His own name felt foreign now, strange, like it belonged to someone else. The phone cameras had captured everything. The entire internet would see it. John Reynolds, the once powerful business owner who had thrown out a black veteran, was now the man who had been thrown out of his own store. His hands curled into trembling fists. This isn't over. It couldn't be over. He had worked for that store. He had built that store. He had sacrificed everything for that store. And now, some old soldier had taken it from him. His stomach twisted with rage, with disbelief, with something worse. Helplessness. John had always been in control. Always. Yet today, he had learned what it meant to be truly powerless. He stopped walking. His knees felt weak, his head light. He staggered to the nearest bench, collapsing onto it. The world moved around him as if nothing had changed. Cars passed by, people walked along the sidewalk, life continued. But for John, his world had just ended. He buried his face in his hands, his body shaking. For years he had been the man people feared, the man people avoided eye contact with, the man who dictated what was right, who was welcome, and who was worth serving. But now he was nothing. And the worst part? No one cared. No one had followed him out of that store. No one had stopped him, offered him comfort, fought for him. Because in the end, he had never earned loyalty. He had ruled with cruelty, with arrogance, with a belief that he was untouchable. But power didn't last forever. And now he had lost everything. He slowly lifted his head, his gaze hollow, empty. Across the street, a coffee shop bustled with life. People sat at tables, talking, laughing, existing in a world he was no longer part of. His reflection stared back at him from the glass windows of the cafe, disheveled, pale, eyes sunken with disbelief. For the first time in his life, he saw himself the way others had always seen him. Not as a businessman, not as a leader, but as a broken man clinging to a power that was never real to begin with. A lump formed in his throat, his hands tightening around the edges of the bench. He had always looked down on others, thinking himself above them. And now he was the one at the bottom, the one looking up. And no one was reaching out to help him. The emptiness inside him grew. And for the first time in his life, John Reynolds felt truly alone. John sat motionless on the bench, his fingers gripping the edges so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The city around him buzzed with life, but to him, everything felt distant, muted, unreal. His body felt heavy, weighed down by an unbearable emptiness. His mind replayed the events over and over, like a broken record he couldn't turn off. The moment James Carter walked into his store, the sneering words he had spat at the veteran, believing himself untouchable. the laughter of the customers when they saw him on his knees, the cold finality of the locked door behind him. John squeezed his eyes shut, his breath coming in uneven gasps. He needed to fix this. He had to fix this. He had spent years building his business, carving out his authority, making himself into someone who couldn't be ignored. He had fought to keep people like James beneath him, believing that was his right. But now, he was the one beneath, and no one was lifting him back up. He lifted his head slowly, his gaze hollow and unfocused. He could still see the store from where he sat, his store, his legacy, now belonging to someone else. Through the large front windows, he saw James Carter moving behind the counter, his movements smooth, unbothered, as if he had owned the place all along. The employees, his former employees, hadn't even missed a beat. They were already working under new leadership, already moving on without him. And the worst part? It looked better without him. The shelves were being stocked properly. Customers moved freely, not out of fear, but comfort. The air inside wasn't thick with tension anymore. For the first time in years, his store was alive. And John wasn't part of it. His throat burned with rage, with humiliation, with something else. Something he wasn't used to feeling. Regret. A sharp pain stabbed through his chest, but he refused to acknowledge it. Number. He wouldn't let this end like this. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. His hands clenched into fists. James Carter had stolen his life from him. Stolen his store, his power, his reputation. But John wasn't going to roll over and accept it. He would fight back. He had to. He forced himself to his feet, his legs weak but determined. He turned toward the store, his chest heaving with desperate fury. He would go back. He would make them listen. He would demand his place back. John took a step forward, then another. And just as he reached the curb, ready to march back inside, he saw them. Two men dressed in dark suits, standing near the entrance of the store. John's steps faltered. They weren't customers. They weren't employees. And the way they stood, calm yet alert, told him everything he needed to know. They were security. James Carter had already anticipated his next move. The message was clear. You don't belong here anymore. John's body turned rigid. A deep, ugly rage burned inside him, but beneath it was something far worse. Helplessness. He could feel the eyes of the security guards on him, watching, waiting. Not because they saw him as a threat, but because he was nothing more than a minor inconvenience now. A man on the outside looking in. The final blow. John's hands trembled at his sides. He had lost before he even had a chance to fight. He could cause a scene, demand his store back, scream at the top of his lungs. But what good would it do? The world had already moved on without him. His entire body sagged with the weight of that truth. Slowly, he turned away from the store. For the first time in his life, John Reynolds had nowhere to go. John walked away, his shoulders slumped, his steps slow and heavy. Every part of him screamed to turn back, to fight, to demand the respect he had always forced out of others. But deep down, he knew there was nothing left to fight for. His store was gone, his reputation was ruined. And worst of all, no one cared. He glanced over his shoulder one last time. The store that had once been his kingdom was no longer even a memory of his rule. The people inside, his former customers, his former employees, had moved on effortlessly, as if he had never existed at all. James Carter stood behind the counter, speaking with Ethan, the young man John had underpaid and disrespected for years. They looked at ease, like a new foundation was already being built, one that didn't include him. John felt something tighten in his chest. It was over, truly, undeniably over. His feet dragged across the pavement as he walked aimlessly down the street, the cold air biting at his skin. He barely noticed the passing cars, the people brushing past him, going about their day. They didn't recognize him. They didn't stop him. For years, John had believed that people respected him, that they feared him, admired him, acknowledged his presence. But the truth was so much simpler. He had never mattered to anyone. Not really. The store had never been about him. It had always been about the people inside it. And now that he was gone, the store thrived without him. Because, in the end, he had been the problem all along. The realization hit him like a brick to the chest. His legs finally gave up beneath him, and he sank onto another bench, his body slumping forward, his hands clasped tightly together. His entire life had been built around that store. His identity, his power, his purpose. And now, without it, who was he? His fingers trembled as he pulled out his phone, his screen lighting up with dozens of notifications. Social media was already on fire. His name, the store, the viral video, everywhere. He opened one of the posts. A news headline stared back at him. Racist store owner kicks out black veteran, instantly regrets it. His stomach twisted violently. The video had millions of views. The comments were endless. People were laughing at him, mocking him, tearing apart the legacy he had once believed was untouchable. The words blurred together as he scrolled. Karma hit this man so hard, he's still flying. James Carter is a national hero. As for John, hope he enjoys unemployment. He thought he was untouchable. Now he's just unforgettable, for all the wrong reasons. John's grip on his phone tightened painfully. He had always controlled the narrative, always dictated what people thought of him. But now the world had rewritten his story. And in this new version, he was the villain. His hands dropped into his lap, his phone slipping from his fingers. This wasn't just a bad day. This was the end of everything he had ever known. The wind picked up around him, rustling his clothes, chilling him to the bone. But no one stopped to offer him warmth. No one even looked his way. And for the first time in his life, John Reynolds was truly invisible. John Reynolds' downfall wasn't just about losing his store. It was about losing everything he thought made him important. He spent years building a false kingdom, one where he ruled through fear, arrogance, and discrimination. He believed power came from stepping on others, controlling who belonged and who didn't. But in the end, he learned the hard way that true power doesn't come from pushing people down. It comes from lifting them up. James Carter didn't have to fight, didn't have to shout, didn't even have to seek revenge. He let John's own actions destroy him. That's the lesson. What we put into the world always comes back to us. John believed he was untouchable, but the truth? No one is untouchable. No matter how much power you think you have, it only lasts as long as people respect you. And respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. This story is a reminder that kindness, fairness, and respect will always win. You never know who you're mistreating. The person you belittle today could be the one who owns everything tomorrow. But the real tragedy? John didn't just lose his store. He lost himself. Because without his power, without his arrogance, there was nothing left. What do you think? Did John deserve his fate? Or do you believe people like him can change? Let us know in the comments below. And if you love stories with powerful lessons and shocking twists, make sure to subscribe so you never miss one. Hit that like button, share this video, and let's keep the conversation going. Because in the end, karma is real.